Good morning. Welcome back for your break. Let's get the next session started, please. I'm David Verrill. I'm the Executive Director of the IDE, the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. We're one of your 3 co-hosts for the event today. And before we get into the next panel with Erik Brynjolfsson and the future of work, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about the IDE itself. The IDE explores how people and businesses will work, interact, and prosper in an era of profound digital transformation. That's where we are right now. Our thesis is that technology is racing ahead ever faster, but that our organizations really aren't keeping pace. And this creates a grand set of challenges of our times, and that's what the IDE focuses upon. We're a research group, and so we focus on basically 4 research themes. 2 of the 4 leaders of our research areas will be providing content today, Erik Brynjolfsson next and Andy McAfee at the end. But you can see that we're focused on measuring productivity, the future of work and inequality, developing new digital business models, social analytics and digital experimentation, and big data and human AI. Not always, but oftentimes the results of our research take the form of best-selling books. And these are 4 of the best-selling books of the last 5 years that our faculty and research staff have put forward. The most recent of which is a book by Andy McAfee and Erik Brynjolfsson on a machine platform crowd, which is highlighting the strategies that most of the technology-driven businesses are using to create success. We have an all-star advisory board, a couple of Nobel laureates, titans of the tech industry, and people like Marissa Meyer, Lumi Labs, Mitchell Baker of the Mozilla Foundation, and Mary Erdoes of JP Morgan are our newest members. We do have a corporate membership program, and we do have a table in the lobby, so if you'd like to learn more about the IDE, we'd be more than happy to speak with you. We also have the great benefit of being supported by a number of private foundations, and one of the primary reasons that they support us is that they're looking for underlying factual data to present as part of their public policy outreach, and we're happy to oblige. That's what we do at the IDE. We also have a number of individual donors who support the IDE, and we're very appreciative of that support. Again, I'm David Verrill. I'm the Executive Director of the IDE and be happy to speak with you throughout the day today. Let's get to the content of our next session. Erik Brynjolfsson is going to tee that panel up by giving a brief presentation about the AI awakening. Erik is Director of the IDE and Professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Good friend, good colleague. Welcome, Erik Brynjolfsson.
Or maybe someone has a sign. Thank you, David. And it's such a pleasure to be here and talk to this audience and share some of the research that we've been doing at the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. As David mentioned, we created this research initiative in order to look at the really amazing things that technology is doing to change business and the economy. Now, there's no question there's also been a lot of hype around some of these technologies and excess claims and overclaiming. But we believe there's a real core of some important things going on. And one of the biggest technologies that's having an impact recently is artificial intelligence and what we call the AI awakening. So let me tell you a little bit about that. And I'm going to bring the panel out to talk about how this technology and related technologies like platforms are beginning to transform work and the economy, and maybe try to make some predictions. It's always dangerous to make predictions, especially about the future, but we'll have some ideas of that. And of course, as you did before, we're looking forward to your questions and comments. We're hoping this will be a dialogue and an interactive discussion. Now, one of the reasons people are so excited about AI is that there's a particular category of AI, machine learning in particular, that's made some very impressive gains. And we're beginning to see technology not only that can help people, but that is beginning to match or even in some cases surpass humans in some very fundamental skills. For instance, in image recognition, there's a big data set called ImageNet with 14 million images. And historically, machines weren't very good at recognizing images like faces or lemons or oranges or starfish. But now, we're beginning to see these systems become much, much better. The blue line here shows the steep improvement in machines at recognizing images, labeling them, telling stories about what's going on in them. Remarkably, on data sets like ImageNet, they're actually doing better than humans are. Humans are imperfect. I don't always know the breeds of different animals that are in those pictures or the different kinds of birds that they might show. But the machine is learning how to recognize all of those things. That very steep part there is when deep learning, a particular category of machine learning, started kicking in, and people like Jeff Hinton started applying it to these large data sets. He'd been working on it kind of in the wilderness for decades, but it really started taking off with much more powerful machines, much larger data sets, and improved algorithms. So I want to stress that we're still very far away from what technologists call artificial general intelligence, AGI. That's what you see in the movies with Terminator, where machines can just do everything and outwit people on every dimension. But that doesn't mean that AI is unimportant. In particular, machine learning has reached these superhuman categories, these superhuman capabilities in a number of categories, including vision and a number of other ones. And in fact, as Andrew McAfee and I describe in our Harvard Business Review article, any kind of a task where you have a set of inputs that map to a set of outputs and you have sufficient data is potentially suitable for machine learning. So that includes not just image and voice recognition, but also guessing which recipes are going to be popular or which drugs are going to be effective. Undoubtedly, there are many applications in your organizations that have these characteristics. Now, this begs the question, exactly how can we identify those applications that work? Because it's not everything. And so working with Tom Mitchell, we've developed a rubric of questions that we publish in Science, and then Daniel Rock also has helped us apply that rubric to a large data set of tasks in the economy. Conveniently, the Department of Labor created a very large data set called ONET, which describes 964 occupations in the US, like chief information officer, like teacher, bus driver, radiologist. And for each of those occupations, they've gone through and described what are the tasks that you need to do for that occupation. Most occupations have about 20 to 30 distinct tasks. Radiologists have 27 tasks that they do, for instance. And that means that there are over 18,000 tasks in the economy that have been described in ONET. So what we did was we took this data set and we matched it to our rubric. We applied our questions to each one of those. Now, we didn't do it all ourselves. We had some grad students. I did some. But ultimately, we tapped into the power of the crowd. We used crowdsourcing tools like Crowdflower and Mechanical Turk. And that allowed us to do it much faster, and we were able to have every single question rated against every single task, at least by 7 different people, so we get some reliability there. So what did we find? Well, we found that if you look at or occupations like radiologist, there are some tasks that are very suitable for machine learning. For instance, interpreting images using computer-aided detection and diagnosis systems. One of the core things that a radiologist does can now be done as well or better by machines, and there are articles in Nature and Science documenting this. But it's also interesting that there are 26 other tasks that radiologists do, and many of them cannot be done well by machines. And this was the pattern we found in occupation after occupation, that very rarely did machine learning just run the table. In most cases, machine learning was able to do some tasks, but not others within a given occupation. And that means that most of the jobs in your organizations will be partly affected by machine learning, but there'll also be things that the humans need to continue to do. We'll have to have partnerships of humans and machines. We'll have to have some re-engineering and redesign as we reallocate tasks between humans and machines. But very rarely will we just completely wipe out entire job categories. Nonetheless, it's kind of fun to look at which jobs are most affected. Are there any massage therapists here? Okay. Well, that's the job that was least affected by machine learning. So they're in the best shape. Concierges, on the other hand, not such good news that a lot of what they're doing, in fact, Google already is creating an automated concierge. And economists, I found, were sort of roughly in the middle of the pack. About half of the things that we do could be somewhat affected by machine learning, but many other things weren't. And that was sort of typical for many of the different kinds of tasks. You can also look at a map of the country. It turns out that different cities and counties have very different mixes of tasks and skills and occupations. Some of them are much more susceptible to machine learning. Some of them are much less likely to be affected by machine learning. So you start getting a pattern of how the economy is likely to be affected geographically over time. Ultimately, this creates a grand challenge. As David said earlier, the reason we created the MIT Initiative in the Digital Economy was to address these challenges of how the economy is changing with these technologies. In particular, we've created something we call the Inclusive Innovation Challenge. We're giving away over $1 million in prizes to companies, organizations, and individuals that are using the technology to create not just prosperity, but widely shared prosperity. Because the one thing that's certain is there's going to be a lot of disruption over the next 5 to 10 years as these technologies work their way through each of your companies, through each of your industries, and through each of your geographies. But if we understand better those effects, and if we work to reinvent our business processes, we're going to be able to take advantage of these technologies to create a lot of wealth, a lot of benefits for lots of different people. So with that, let me now call out the panelists, so we'll dive into this discussion a little bit more. And again, I encourage you to add your questions as well. So would Jason, Iyad, and Elisabeth please come on out? Jason is a professor of political economy. Iyad is a professor over at the Media Lab. And Dr. Elisabeth Reynolds is the executive director of the Work of the Future Task Force. So welcome, guys. And let me start with you, Liz, because just yesterday we were having a meeting of the Work of the Future Task Force. It's a really big, important initiative that MIT has undertaken, in part inspired by some of the stuff that I was just talking about. Tell us a little bit about that. You're taking a leading role in that, and tell us, why is MIT doing this?
Well, clearly, this is an important topic for everyone. And a few times in the history of MIT, the president of MIT has said, this issue is of such importance to society, we want to collectively create an MIT initiative to address this challenge and to come up with possibilities for pathways forward. And so just a few months ago, President Reif announced the task force on the work of the future. We like to think that we've really changed the field on this by calling this the work of the future and not the future of work.
It's our first innovation.
It's a first innovation, exactly. And I won't go into the, what we call it internally, WTF. But in fact, the point here is to affirm and assert that there will be work in the future. And our challenge is to make sure that that work is a quality work, that is meaningful work, that is accessible work, and I think that's part of what this task force is all about. It draws from across the institute. There's so much going on. Erik's work, the work from CSAIL, cognitive science and how we learn, a lot of the labor economists here. But to bring us into a shared conversation, we hope that we can have an even greater impact in trying to change the dynamic and the discourse.
Yeah, speaking of that, I mean, I got the sense talking to President Reif and others that there's concern around sort of a tech backlash. You see it in Silicon Valley with Facebook, but in particular, there's this emerging narrative that robots are going to take all our jobs and tech is a bad thing for a lot of people. Tell us more about that narrative and how it differs, if at all, I think it does, from the work of the future narrative.
Exactly, and I think we can all, in the popular press, basically, the fact is that technology is this thing that is happening to us, and we're all trying to figure out how we're going to survive. We're really interested in trying to change that narrative to one in which we understand technology as a tool. And I think that if you look at a lot of what we hear in the popular press, it's all of these predictions, all about what we see down the future. And I think, as Erik has said before, the fact is that that's only based on what we see today, sort of job by job, piece by piece. It doesn't take into account the complementarity that you've spoken about. It doesn't take into account the demand side.
So complementarity means that the technology doesn't just substitute for work, but sometimes it amplifies the benefits that humans can bring to the job.
Exactly. And so if people are familiar with the McKinsey report recently, they basically estimate that over 2/3 of the current occupations will essentially be enhanced by or changed by this technology we're talking about, and only 5% really displaced. And I think we have to understand that in the sort of scheme of history and how often we see churning of the economy, et cetera. And I spend a lot of time talking to manufacturers. And while manufacturing is a relatively small part of our economy, about 9% of employment, it has actually got a significant impact. It's one of the largest sectors of our economy. It has higher R&D investment. It has a higher percentage of non-college educated workers. And what we see there is a real transformation by this technology. The introduction of the cobot is helping us replace the routine work and allow workers to be doing something else. And while industrial robotics may have really changed things for the automotive industry, I think as we see the cobots more flexible, more accessible, being able to be programmed by some of our technicians and our operators, it's actually it's upskilling workforce, it's creating a lot of opportunity and growth for these companies. And we do have to deal with the displacement. I don't want to sort of play down that, but it is a small percentage of actually the growth that we see. If anybody saw this recent FedEx article about their facility in North Carolina, out of 2% of the workforce will be displaced by these robots, but they have a huge amount of growth that's happening across the labor force. So I think there's more opportunity than we are really understanding yet at this point.
That's a great question. I see that there's questions already coming in, so please vote on those. But let me bring Jason into the conversation. And another thing that people are concerned about is some of the things that's happening with wages. And in another way that cars are used is with Uber and some of these online platforms. Tell me a little bit about, I know you've studied these online platforms quite a bit. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing there, some of the challenges they're facing, regulatory and otherwise, and how that future of work and the work of the future is changing.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we know, urban mobility, so transit, particularly through firms like Uber and Lyft in the US and their competitors overseas, have been one of the arenas where we've seen some of the biggest transformations. And thinking about this in the context of AI and machine learning is really key, because the core of the platform, of course, is the use of machine learning techniques and algorithms to match, for example, riders and drivers if we think about urban mobility. So it's a neat example where we might think that here's a technology. It's certainly radically transformed. It's disrupted an existing field, taxis typically. And of course, it's been deployed around the world. So we might think that the technology might play itself out in the same way everywhere, but in fact, it doesn't. So if we look across different markets, we see major challenges that firms like Uber, for instance, as the American firm that has gone the furthest in trying to expand globally, facing in different markets. We can think about Uber's retreat from China, for instance, a couple of years ago, and more recently from Southeast Asia in the last couple of months. And so there are interesting ways of thinking about why this might be the case, right? So here's a firm that has lots of money, has an innovative technology, has a big brand. So I'll give one quick example from the Southeast Asia context. One of the things that observers in places like Bangkok, for instance, have noted, so of course a major market in Southeast Asia, have noted with Uber is that there's challenges in understanding the structure of the market when they entered. So for instance, in Bangkok, the existing taxi industry is not just privately owned, but in fact has ownership that ties in with the government in a variety of very important ways. So it ties in with the military, and as many may know, the military recently took over the government a few years ago. It ties in with the police. And so the structure of the market is intimately locked into the political and social structure in that context. And so just having a sort of strong technology and a strong brand doesn't necessarily guarantee success without understanding that kind of local context. And so I think it's one of the ways in which we can think about how new technologies, AI, machine learning, as innovative and as powerful as they are, still have to contend with local social, political, local social and political environments in which they're deployed.
Mm-hmm. It makes a lot of sense. So we've heard from a couple different industries now, some manufacturing, some of the urban mobility, transportation. Iyad, you've looked at this broader set of how the economy is changing, using some of the same data, the ONET data that I described a little while ago. In fact, looking forward to joining forces with you on some of that. But you've looked at it from more of a network perspective. Tell me a little bit about the polarization that you're seeing and the different groups that are emerging.
Sure. Well, many of you are probably familiar with the story of the hollowing of the middle class. And basically, there's this idea that Well-paid jobs are growing, low-paid jobs are growing, and the middle-paid jobs are diminishing, which has impact, and consequences on the size of the middle class as part of society and kind of bifurcation. Now, usually what these studies look at is they use wage as a proxy for skill. And I think we don't really understand very well, how are these jobs different fundamentally? And what we did is using this kind of data and network science techniques, we were able to map the dependencies between the skills. And what we found is that the skills in the workplace are actually bifurcated into two islands of skills. So there is an island of skills that are sensory physical, so depend things like multi-limb coordination, glare sensitivity, spatial orientation, and so on, that all depend on each other and complement each other. And then there's a separate island that is heavy in social skills like negotiation, persuasion, managing financial
resources. Just to be clear, when you say island, you're not talking about like physical separate groups? Or
that's right.
In what sense are they separate or together?
So they are kind of islands in two senses. One is that your job is more likely to be in one, depend heavily on one of these groups of skills or another. Very few jobs.
So if you have some of those skills, you're likely to also have the other skills?
That's right.
They all kind of cluster together.
Exactly. So very few people would combine, these kind of very manual skills with higher level social and let's say analytical skills. And so there are basically two classes of workers that we see, and I think it's one of.
And that just emerges from the data when you look.
That emerges completely bottom up from the data. It's not based on our own classification. And then what we do is we project different cities in the US, so different metropolitan statistical areas on this network, and we find something kind of concerning that the cities that are doing well, they live in the good cluster of skills. Most of their workers are competitive in these skills, and a lot of the more industrial sort of farming communities are in the other cluster. And this is a problem because if one of these clusters gets hit or disrupted somehow by machines, we actually don't know what will happen. It could lift them up if complementarity is good, but it can also decimate them, and they will find it more difficult to move to the other cluster.
Well, that actually is a good lead into the most popular question on my pad here, coming in from Slido. The question is, there are roughly 6 million unemployed people in the US and about 6 million job vacancies. So isn't this more of a matching or reskilling of the unemployed issue? So is that, why don't you take that first, Iyad, because you think that there's an issue, say, moving from one of those clusters to the other?
So we haven't done the analysis yet, but I imagine that it could have something to do with the reskilling requirement, that perhaps a lot of people, basically if you're, to get to the good cluster, or let's say the today good cluster, which pays better actually, you need education.
The one with more analytical skills is the one that pays better.
That's right, exactly. So the extent to which a occupation relies on the analytical and social skills is a very good predictor of income, median income for those jobs. But they cost time and money because they correlate with education as well. So I think that could be one of the issues, and this is why it makes it difficult for people who have all these physical and sensory skills. They cannot reskill gradually. That's what this polarization tells us, that reskilling has to be done wholesale,
all or nothing,
so that you can jump to the better.
At least
cluster.
Currently, maybe we can change those clusters. Jason, can these platforms help? I mean, is that part of the role or maybe goal that we could have for these platforms?
Yeah, possibly, in at least two ways. So one is, of course, again, platforms are fundamentally about matching. But another way, and this maybe speaks to mobility, is sort of ties in with the finding that one of the big challenges oftentimes with these kinds of mismatches, so the existence of jobs on the one hand with unemployment, this kind of paradox in the labor market, has to do with the ability of workers to get to these kinds of employment. So it has to do with moving around cities in precisely the kind of context that Iyad was speaking of. So there's promise here. So one sort of suggestion, and this is one of the kind of positive, more utopian, I suppose, futuristic sort of ideas, is that autonomous vehicles, again, an innovation that will rely heavily on AI and machine learning, could potentially help to move people more efficiently around cities.
So just like physically getting them to their jobs.
Exactly, physically getting them to their jobs in ways that the existing transportation networks can. So public transit, for example, has lots of blind spots. Some of them are features of the urban environment.
Like the people who live in the outer boroughs of New York or on the other side, on the East Bay in San Francisco, some of them commute long, long times.
Precisely.
Are you imagining that, you know, a 2-hour commute is brutal if you have to drive, but maybe if you're riding in an autonomous vehicle and sleeping or doing email or watching TV, it's not as bad.
Absolutely, right? And precisely if it's shared along the lines that firms like Uber and Lyft with Pool and Lyftline are experimenting with, which are techniques, by the way, which have existed for a long time with carpooling and in informal markets with dollar vans and so forth.
But these platforms can improve the matching a lot better. The algorithms will know what other people are along the route, and it seems like the reputation systems are working to get people to kind of carpool with people who are strangers.
Exactly, exactly. There is that possibility. Now, whether that possibility will be realized will be the really big question.
And that might help the matching. Liz, I mean, part of it also is, in the question was the reskilling and upskilling. I know that's part of what we're doing at the Work of the Future as well.
Right, well, absolutely, we have a skills mismatch problem in this country. I think that's been well documented. We have a lot of the growth happening in these high-skilled jobs, and we don't have the people, at least in the regional labor markets, filling them. I think that's one dynamic. The other dynamic here is the fact that those who are in Iyad's point, the sort of that cluster, the challenge of actual social mobility and the challenge of kind of getting stuck in a place where there's pathways forward are very challenging. So even if you can find even if we're working towards the skills match, can we actually get the people to those jobs? We have less than 2% of the American population ever moves across a state boundary.
Wait, what? Say that again?
Less than 2% annually of people moving across state boundaries, right? We're creatures of our location. And so part of this, the dynamic here is very geographically bounded. And I think that's really important when we think about what happens in terms of skills and upskilling. I have a lot of confidence and excitement about what we're doing to train the next generation. Erik and I were just with one of the cognitive scientists here at MIT talking about, we're just figuring out how
John Gabrielli,
how everybody learns. And guess what? For all of you who have children in grammar school like I do, those tablets, we have no clue. No clue. Do they help? Do they not? Are kids learning? We don't know. So we have a long way to go. There's a lot we can learn in terms of training the next generation for the skills that we're talking about. I think the bigger challenge are the incumbent workers now and the generation and moving into a new set of skills for the incumbent workers.
Well, I'm finding this iPad very useful, actually, for getting some questions. But let me focus on this geography thing, which is something I hadn't anticipated would be such an important part of this conversation. But I know that also, Iyad, you've been looking at city size and the different clusters of skills there, at least kind of looking backwards historically, the way that cities have evolved. And I know, Jason, you're maybe looking a little bit more forward. But let's go to you first, Iyad. What are you learning from the way cities have a division of labor currently?
Yeah, so initially we thought that we had really no prior. We know that big cities are clearly prosperous, but we also know that they're prosperous precisely because of the division of labor, which is an idea that goes back.
You say clearly prosperous, because we see a lot of homeless people.
That's right, but on average, large cities would have greater GDP per capita, for example.
Okay, so on average, big cities are richer than smaller cities?
That's right. So this is a general kind of well-known trend in people, in urban geography and economy, and you find that these cities are wealthier, and if you go back to Adam Smith, the reason why people moved from the countryside is because of this division of labor, that instead of training an artisan who knows everything and can make really sophisticated things, you train people in very specific tasks.
So Adam Smith had this famous insight that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So if you have a bigger market, a bigger city, you can have more fine-grained division of labor, and he showed that in many cases, having more fine-grained division of labor, like in his pin factory, you can create more wealth than having one generalist that tried to do everything.
That's right, but like the flip side of that is potentially that each individual, even though the large city is collectively more prosperous, maybe individuals are less skilled because they can do one thing. And so in our studies, that was one hypothesis, that in cities, individual jobs are more likely to be disrupted from automation.
Because they're less general, so they're kind of more fragile in some ways.
Exactly. Like in the countryside, maybe a pharmacist can do a whole bunch of other things, or because
they have to.
They have to.
I mean, take it to the limit. Robinson Crusoe had to do everything.
That's right. There you go. But surprisingly, we found that actually it is smaller cities that are more susceptible to automation and to being disrupted. Whether it's a good or a bad disruption, we don't know. And the reason seems to be that even though you have a lot of division of labor in the big cities, you also have a lot of creative people who combine their work and ideas and labor to create more products. So basically, cities are good for teamwork. And so I think the old idea from Adam Smith of just sitting in a sweatshop and doing kind of making pins is no longer describes the modern city. It's the modern
that sounds like very boring work, just putting heads on the top of pins all day long.
That's right. So I think today, to work in a city, you need to also be able to work with other people. You need teamwork skills, you need social skills. And I think this is what makes these jobs more resilient.
So Jason, how, if at all, is this changing? Particularly, you mentioned urban mobility, but are there other things that we're seeing changing in the ways that people can connect with each other?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one thing that is important for us to think about is, and this goes maybe a little bit to the historical point, is the historical structure of cities and how they look different in different places. So in the US, for example, because of suburbanization in the 50s and 60s and sort of white flight from cities, you get oftentimes sort of underinvestment in cities, and so lower skills and a lower skilled labor force to a large extent in cities, and the growth of more and more jobs in the suburbs. So this is part of the geography of the skills mismatch.
Well, wait, so I just heard something that sounded different from Iyad, so you guys need to reconcile that. Is the core cities having less wealth and lower skills, or more wealth and more division of labor?
I would say
both
that,
true?
So in our case, I mean, we looked at averages. So we haven't looked at the distribution, and I think this is something that we have to look at. That maybe big cities have more wealth and they have very resilient jobs, but maybe this is at the expense of a whole bunch of people who live in.
Could be more uneven.
Cities.
You could have more inequality.
Exactly.
City, yeah.
I mean that's sort of my casual empiricism. When I walk through San Francisco, you see homeless people and you see billionaires.
Right.
More than you would see in maybe a small rural town.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, Boston, by the way, is
Or Boston.
one of the top 10 has that ranking, one of the top 10 most
That's
unequal
right.
cities. I was just going to make a point to the pin example. I think a modern day version of that is the Amazon Fulfillment Center. And it's an interesting example if people have followed Amazon's automation of a lot of their fulfillment centers. On one hand, they brought in Kiva, which was an MIT company, and they've been able to minimize workers moving from point A to B across this warehouse. Now we have our robots doing that.
These Kiva robots that they bring the shelves to the workers instead of the worker going to the shelf. So they didn't just do a one-for-one substitution of here's a human, we're going to replace them with a machine. Instead, they reinvented the whole process, which I think is a theme we see over and over again when people introduce automation.
Exactly, and so on one hand, great news. Now we don't have to, people are not moving from A to B at long distances, et cetera. They can stay where they are, and they can sort of pick and pack, right? That is what they're doing now. The downside of this, of course, is that they've designed now a new job that's really kind of ergonomically difficult for people and doesn't allow for the variety of tasks and doesn't allow for mobility during the day, 8 hours standing in the same place. And so, in fact, what we're hoping in our work is, with part of the work of the future, is to think about how do we design technology with humans in mind? Because in that case, in fact, we've solved one problem, but maybe we've created a few others. And we need to think about designing in the technology ways in which the humans are actually advantaged and using all of the skills that they can bring to a job.
Right. There's lots of different ways of using these technologies, some of which de-skill workers or make them more precarious, and others that maybe increase their value. In fact, there's a word I learned a few years ago, precarity, and I don't know how many in the audience have ever heard the word precarity? Nobody? Precarity, really? Okay, well, it's something that sociologists use, and I know that Jason was explaining it to me the other day. So tell me what that is and why it's important.
Yeah, sure. So one of the big transformations that we've seen in the labor market, of course, is the change in the sort of employment contracts. So Liz mentioned FedEx in a recent article earlier in our conversation, and FedEx is interesting because there's a really important case about 5 or 6 years ago where the courts essentially ruled that workers could be considered independent entrepreneurs, right? So it was a way in which workers in a firm like FedEx, the same holds with firms like Uber and so on, their status could be shifted from one that was no longer the kind of prototypical sort of long-term, benefits receiving kind of employment relationship that we used to think about in the sort of 50s and 60s in the sort of Fordist period. Instead, their employment relations governed much more by a sort of short-term contract. And this is an idea that sort of pins into this notion of precarity, that their work is no longer guaranteed, or their employment status is no longer guaranteed in ways that it used to be in the past, especially in industrialized
Precarity from the word precarious.
Exactly right. So their worker status is now much more precarious, both in terms of being able to be moved completely out of the firm, or the number of hours that they work becomes much more flexible. And this flexibility on one hand, from the sort of managerial side, builds in efficiencies, but from the worker side,
give me some concrete examples of precarious work or precarity. Like, give me an example of somebody whose become more precarious.
Sure. So the FedEx worker, who, as an example, sort of delivery worker, for instance, who their daily tasks now are much more tied to market demand, and that demand actually is determined through machine learning techniques, usually. The Uber driver is another example. But we can just think about the rise of temporary work even more generally. I mean, temp work we've seen in arenas that we don't normally conceptualize as high-tech or as relying on technologies for governing work. But nevertheless, temporary work has risen tremendously over the course of the last 10 or 20 years in the US.
So this might be like a retail worker who doesn't know what their hours are going to be the following week. Sometimes they get 12 hours, sometimes they get 40 hours, and they have to rearrange their childcare and everything around that.
Absolutely, absolutely, which of course creates all sorts of dislocations. I mean, not just in terms of their daily lives, like adjusting for childcare, as Erik mentioned, but also their income. So, people have, most of us have fixed expenses,
pay the rent,
mortgage, exactly every month. So if your income becomes variable, then that creates a huge problem. So not even bringing in things like, potential.
What about the other side of it, though? And you mentioned this a little bit about the flexibility. I mean, I've interviewed my Uber and Lyft drivers. I just sort of an amateur sociologist or anthropologist. A lot of them say that one of the things they like best is the flexibility. They get to make their own hours. One of them that used to be a taxi driver said, I always had to work, this 12-hour shift. Now, if I want to go, see my daughter's piano recital or whatever, I can go to that. Or if I want to take an afternoon off, or if I want to work some extra, I'm sitting around Saturday, what the heck, I'm going to go work an extra 8 hours. They get to choose. So doesn't it matter whether the worker or the employer makes that choice?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. So your example of taxi drivers is really interesting. So one of the things that I've observed in similar conversations is that many, for example, Uber or Lyft drivers do enjoy the flexibility in time. Another area of flexibility, though, which they don't like quite as much, is the flexibility in what they're paid.
You mean like the surge pricing?
Surge pricing. There's sometimes variation in the.
Or you just can't find a ride.
Yeah, you can't find a ride. There's variation in essentially the commission that the ride-sharing firms take. They can be directed to take rides to areas that they may or may not want to go to, simply because they may be far out of their way. They may be close to the end of when they would like to work. So some of the benefits of flexibility, certainly are choosing their own hours and so forth, which might be nice, also come with these potential disadvantages as well. And maybe this is a feature of the, again, a new economy, but it's one of the ways in which this kind of work becomes increasingly unpredictable and precarious.
And then there's the benefits. I mean, in the United States, most benefits, healthcare, retirement, et cetera, are linked to an employer. And if you are an entrepreneur, you don't necessarily get those taken care of unless you pay for them yourself. So
Absolutely.
That's another thing. So let me go to some of the questions here. One of the top questions is going a little different direction, is regarding the vast data that organizations have, what challenges exist leveraging that data in a world of AI and ML? So we've talked about some of the data, whether it's from Uber or from manufacturing plants or others, that's now available. All of us, our mobile phones are just continuously reporting an enormous amount of information about us to the powers that be. So what are some of the opportunities there, and what are some of the challenges for that matter? I guess all of us are getting this week all those emails about GDPR and the new privacy regulations that every company, almost every company is setting up. What do you see as the challenges and opportunities there, especially when it comes to AI and machine learning? Anybody?
Well, I think one of the challenges is to know that the data is up to date and is actually reflects some underlying process. So, for example, if you're trying to predict the movement of a stock price, or you're trying to predict the demand for Uber in different locations, I think these are fairly well, a bit more structured. But sometimes you build a predictive model and then from data, and then you let it go wild, and you use it to optimize all sorts of business processes. But then things change, and sometimes when they change, the kind of the distribution of the things that are happening in the world shifts because of some change in regulations or something else.
Give me some specific examples. I mean, are there some things maybe at the Media Lab or elsewhere that you've seen where this is happening?
So I would imagine something like, you could let's say optimize something to do with transportation or with logistics. And then all of a sudden some change in regulation takes place. And this has kind of impacts on your business that are very indirect. So all of a sudden maybe there's fewer migrants moving into the country or into the place, which means then that they would demand fewer removalists, and there's kind of trickle effects. And I think if you train machine learning models on one set of data that is historical, and then deploy it, and the world changes because of something you haven't really thought would impact your business, then you could be losing out on further opportunities to optimize the business. So in this case, a lot of the new kind of techniques in AI have this online learning, so algorithms that basically continuously learn. So it's not like you train them and then once they trained, you deploy them. They have to continuously learn
from their experiences.
From the experience, from the real world, nonstop, essentially.
Well, how do you are there concerns about them maybe learning the wrong things? There's been some discussion of the biases that we humans have when we make hiring decisions, parole decisions, recommendations, loan decisions, and will those biases be learned by our machines?
That's right. So I think, feel free to comment, but essentially that, humans are biased already, and some of these biases are good, because we need to discriminate, for example, between something that is good quality and lower quality. That's a useful bias. But there are also the bad type of bias, which is bias that is discriminatory or breaks some laws or norms in some way. For instance, discriminating in hiring decisions against some minority group. And I think, AI is now making these biases a bit more salient and a bit more identifiable, because now there is a machine. We have a better understanding of how the data causes the bias. And I think that's going to it's creating already pressure on companies to be a bit more thoughtful. And if they're not, then that's a real public relations kind of reputational risk for companies.
Right. I mean, this sort of gets to one of the questions I see here on my iPad here, is that many people thought that social media would usher in this wonderful future of connectedness and community, and in many ways it didn't. It led to some very dysfunctional outcomes. So how do we manage the risk that AI and automation won't have those similar sort of unintended consequences? I mean, there's lots of upside potential, but what are some of the risks that you see that we should be alert to? I mean, biases is one. You can say more about that, or are there others that we should worry about, Liz?
I mean, I think generally, as someone who thinks about also sort of communal assets and public goods, when we think about the data that's being generated at, say, for example, in a city level, and all of the information that, in fact, a city can gather about its residents. You know, that's powerful information. And a couple things about that. First, what we've had historically right now, if people are familiar with the smart city movement, you know, smart city 1.0 was basically like, we have all this data, this is great, you know, but no sense of, you know, to what end? What problem are we trying to solve? You know, we've come back to this and said, oh, in fact, you know, data in and of itself is not going to help us figure out exactly what we're going to use this data for. And so access to that data is very powerful. And ownership of that data is really powerful. And we have situations now, Toronto is a great example. Google's experimenting with, you know, basically Toronto hands over a street or a community and says, go at it, you know, figure out what we learned. Well, who owns that data?
Say go at it? What is that?
Sorry.
So what does Google do?
So Google essentially has and Jason, you may be more familiar, but it's basically taken over, it's sort of sensorized, if you will, a couple blocks or an area of understanding, more than, you know, sort of large area, where it's capturing data on mobility, on cell phone use, on you name it. And so, you know, what we can do now under a street lamp in terms of capturing data and telling us something about what's happening during the day, you know, could be interesting and could be useful to somebody. And the question is that proprietary to Google? Is it, obviously, it's owned by the city as well, but does the city have the resources or capabilities to actually, you know, do good with that?
So Jason, have you seen some success stories? And let me tie it into one of the most popular questions here. More broadly, what are some of the most impressive value creation cases we've seen in major companies, and I'll say cities as well, about using the power of machine learning? What are some of the big successes? But why don't we start with what's happening there with these cities?
Yeah, well, let me just pick up on the social media point and what's taking place. Yeah, so, you know, to respond to what you said about social media, one of the things that we perhaps have to remember with the social media sort of revolution is that, you know, our first thought is that social media will help us to connect with others and so forth, but also the entities that have control over the data and the way the data is used also may have different incentives for how it's used. And so that's something that we have to always bear in mind.
Be specific. How do you see the incentives
So the
different?
Cambridge Analytica example is probably the most recent and the most salient, where there were political incentives to utilize data and experiments with the data, which, you know, as we know, firms like Facebook are continuously running. Experiments that are very similar to
And even without going to that one, which I guess they may have broken some rules, Facebook's basic incentives is to maximize ad revenue.
Absolutely.
Which means maximize engagement. And de facto, apparently, that often means maximizing outrage and emotion. And looking at some of the ways the algorithms work, outrage and emotion, Sinan Aral, our colleague, has shown some of this, that tends to, sadly, be correlated with a lot of lies and fake news. So this algorithm is trying to maximize revenue, you know, maybe a sort of neutral-sounding goal is de facto maximizing emotional valence and even false news. Probably not what they intended, but that's where their incentives were leading them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that has implications for this question about value creation. So it suggests at minimum that we think about value creation quite broadly with respect to, well, value for whom and what entities, and how might value creation for one organization, one firm, have different sort of social implications for public goods and so forth. So there's a broader societal question around this question of value creation, which is really important. And sometimes can get lost, I think, when we think about data and machine learning, because it often seems so technical. But in fact, ultimately, it's always social, and the outcomes are ones that we have to think about in those terms.
Well, that's sort of a cautionary tale. What about some on the optimistic side here? So what are some, have you guys seen some examples of AI machine learning being, you know, particularly successful, something that people in the audience here could learn from as things that we could do? What are some good examples?
I mean, I think there are probably more examples, you know, from some of the companies that are in the room, but I think of healthcare as probably the area where we will see, and we have seen, I think to date, enormous benefits societally wise because of the ability to kind of actually compile the data, aggregate the data. And the challenge on that front, which is always fascinating to me, is incenting our institutions to share their data, that are our research centers, our hospitals, et cetera. The regulatory framework, the institutional framework often is very much getting in the way of the sharing of that data for the larger good. But I think there are a number of different initiatives in process now that are trying to bring some of that data, obviously, keeping privacy and HIPAA rules in place, but to try and share and really bring that to bear on our investigations of diseases.
So another company that's working also in healthcare is DeepMind. And DeepMind was purchased by Google a few years ago. And they're very famous for building programs that play Atari and Go. Right. But they have actually been extremely successful at cutting down the cost of the energy cost of the Google server farms substantially. And we're talking hundreds of millions worth, if not more, of reduction in energy costs.
And how did they do that?
And they did this using machine learning. So I think machine learning is kind of this general purpose optimization technology. So you basically learn from experience how to improve something, right? Something we do as humans. But when this thing is so complex, like an entire server farm, then the best engineers will try to come up with the most accurate models of how the load fluctuates, based on the demand on different servers and how to optimize this. They're very clever people, but the machine was actually able to discover new kind of niche in terms of even more optimal algorithms for load balancing and kind of allocation of work between the servers that has real implications on not only, in this case, something good, which is reducing energy consumption, that is actually pro-social, has environmental benefits, but also has bottom line benefits for the company.
Good. Any other examples you guys want to touch on? One that, Paul Doherty has a new book. He's the Accenture CTO, and he talks about using that AI is likely to increase the demand for people in the middle, those who ensure there's no unconscious bias or communicate goals or algorithms or add context or add otherwise, kind of manage these systems. Do you agree with that hypothesis? And do you see that is one of the places where we're going to have AI, humans and machines work more closely together?
So certainly one of the things that I would agree with is the extent to which that point notes that there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. And so there's a lot to be positive about, I think, and I think both you and Liz noted this at the beginning, about the potential for machine learning. And the way that some of these techniques are designed and the way in which business processes are imagined are really going to be crucial. In that sense, we really control the future of AI and the ways in which AI and machine learning will be built into work. So on one hand, this example suggests ways in which there will be new opportunities that deal with some of the potential downsides. But I think we can also think about ways in which machine learning can be used to complement existing work to make it even better. So healthcare, again, is a nice example. If we think about the kind of physical assistance that robots can provide for doing complex but really important care work. Lifting people out of beds, for example, which seems simple, but is actually really quite difficult.
You have to be strong.
You have to be quite strong. You have to know how to manage the particular ailment that the person
strong
may have.
And gentle.
Yeah, exactly, strong and gentle. Yeah. And so this is an example where these kinds of machines could really complement existing work, particularly given an aging workforce in much of the industrialized world.
Right, gets to Liz's healthcare example. So more broadly, are there certain, this is really one of the top questions that hasn't been asked yet, is in the work of the future, ultimately begins and ends with people. How do we as CIOs change our hiring practices from the audience to meet future needs? So you talked a little bit about some of those ways. What are some other things that CIOs should be looking for, and what can they do to change their hiring practices?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of work, and it's actually going on at Sloan and elsewhere, to understand that process a little bit more in detail, to understand, in part, kind of the biases and from a data point of view, what we understand. But I think also to understand the capability for learning. How do we hire people who will be in a position to be continually learning throughout their job? Because their task is going to change. their job is going to change. And so as a CIO, I think it's looking at those skill sets that are really allowing for flexibility, for use of judgment, for for teamwork, for problem solving, all those things we know are important, but also an understanding of how we're going to continue to learn and help our workforce and our employees be part of that lifelong learning process, because that is exactly what the sort of response is to all these changes going on.
Would you encourage CIOs to use more tools to screen applicants and to help make hiring decisions? Do you think that machine learning can help with finding the people to work with machine learning?
I think it should be both. Yeah, I think actually that we should not put our head in the sand about this. These are tools. I mean, at MIT, a lot of people trying to invent these tools, and again, responsible tools that are going to improve what probably, historically, I'm going to guess that we as humans haven't been in the best position to make the best decisions over time. If we had to kind of look, on a statistical basis. So I'm hoping that kind of technology will enhance, but certainly not replace the human element.
Well, it could get back to that earlier question that was raised about the 6 million unemployed people and the 6 million job openings. It seems like maybe there's matches there that we don't know. The average person doesn't apply for 6 million jobs, and the average the average company doesn't look at 6 million applicants. So there's probably some that could have been a match that they didn't know about. And on the other hand, 6 million isn't that big a number for a machine, right? I mean, they could, in theory, systematically analyze things a lot more effectively and find those kinds of matches, especially if you combine it with knowledge of what kinds of skills can be imparted. So even people who aren't a perfect match right now, in principle, could say, well, here's a skill ladder that this kind of person has the basic skills they need, and if we spend 3 months training or whatever, we could get them working.
Another point that was made by John Gabrielli, who's the cognitive science I mentioned earlier, was that from his experience, very few companies have any idea as to whether the training they give in-house is effective. That's kind of problematic.
Yeah, it's amazing. They spend all this money and time on it.
And continue to spend the money.
They don't go back and analyze, did it work?
Well, and it's hard to figure that out. And so I would say, job number one going forward is let's use this technology to help us understand how to help our employees learn.
Right, and he gave the example that he made a simple intervention that was like a 30% improvement in the learning. So there's lots of room for improvement. These aren't like 1 or 2% improvements. These are some really big additions.
I would maybe add to that the reason why we often don't know if like an intervention, like a training program actually works is that a lot of companies don't operate like experimental scientists. And I think this is a really good opportunity and something that machine learning can help with as well. So for instance, if you could take all the workers and randomly assign them, to 2 different programs for
learning. Different training programs.
2 different training programs, and then you can measure, for example, a year later.
Some go to MIT Exec Ed, some go to Harvard Exec Ed.
For instance. And then
MIT wins.
And then a year later, you measure their productivity or whatever measurable outcomes you're interested in, and then you can see. And because you've randomized the people into these programs, you know that the only way that they differ on average is the program that they were assigned to, and that would be the more effective one.
Yeah, that's one of the things, we were talking about this yesterday. David Otter and some of the other people at the JPAL, the Poverty Action Lab, are working on some randomized assignment to see what kinds of education and training actually make a difference and don't. I mean, I don't know how many hundreds of billions or maybe it's trillions of dollars we spend on education and training, and we don't have as systematic, as scientific, as you say, approach to doing it. Well, we're wrapping up towards the end of our time here, so I'm going to ask you guys a really hard question and give you guys each a chance to answer it. And so why don't you close with something on this topic that you believe to be true, but you think most other people don't believe to be true or isn't as widely known? Is there something that you've been thinking about that sort of runs against the conventional wisdom in the area of AI and machine learning? Anybody want to take a shot at that?
That technology is going to make me a better bridge player, I don't think a lot of people believe that.
You believe it's true?
I believe it to be true. Others do not believe that to be true.
All right. 1 year from now, we'll come back and we'll
Right.
find out whether there are some actually really good AI bridge playing games. So I hope you're not going to like have it under the table and helping you.
I
while
wouldn't
you're,
do that. That's
no.
against all thinking. Yeah.
So for me, I believe that social media has always been seen as this thing that will connect us to the world.
Yeah.
So it basically, we're an exploring, species. We like to venture into new worlds and explore new environments and meet new people. And social media clearly amplifies this because you can connect to anyone around the world. Mm-hmm. But once we combined social media with machine learning, mm-hmm. it became much easier for the thing to come to us than us to find it. So in the past, we used to try to find, we want to find interesting information, interesting experiences, and we would want interesting people. And now, because machine learning is so good at knowing who we are, often better than we are, because it can use data from billions of other people, some of whom are like us, then it's bringing the world to us. So all we need to do is sit back and look at the news feed.
Do you mean like recommendation? Okay, so it curates things for you.
That's right. So I think that this is something that is, I think, counterintuitively causing the opposite effect, that it's actually making the world more closed, more insular, more inward-looking, because all we want to see is a mirror of ourselves and how others see us as well. Yeah,
so we end up being kind of balkanized, or the filter bubble could emerge where we end up filtering out things that aren't part of our worldview and only seeing things that the system thinks we'll like to see. And that's not always healthy. Sometimes we have to see things we don't want to see, I guess. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very interesting danger and paradox there as well. Jason?
Yeah, so the one that I often think about recently is, so we often think about algorithms and machine learning techniques as, on one hand, knowable. So you have really smart engineers or data scientists who devise some of these techniques and then utilize them to do anything from Google search to many of the kinds of work processes that we've discussed. But crucially, there's an idea that the data scientists sort of know what the algorithms are doing. So you could imagine, if you ask Larry Page or Sergey Brin, how does Google search work, they could just sort of tell you. And in this sense, the kind of optimization that takes place is kind of the opposite of a bureaucracy, where you have the idea of a bureaucracy as many people not really knowing what everyone else is doing. But in fact, a reality of how algorithms work is that many of the data scientists who create them don't necessarily understand how they are working. So they're operating on their own in many respects. Mm-hmm. And so a world of work within the private sector or the public sector that's increasingly driven by algorithms and machine learning could form its own kind of bureaucracy. And in a sense, that's kind of exactly the opposite of what we tend to think about as these new technologies sort of debureaucratizing, I suppose, organizations and processes.
But in a way, they're codifying a set of rules and making them more permanent in some way, it could be.
Absolutely, making them more permanent. New sets of rules that are being determined, but are themselves really difficult to understand.
Like Larry Lessig talks about code as law in a way.
Absolutely.
It sort of codifies things.
Yeah, this is really nice. If anybody watches a British comedy called The IT Crowd, there's a very... The IT Crowd?
The IT Crowd.
Yeah, it's a very...
This is the IT Crowd.
Yeah. This one is about an IT department at the bottom of a building, and everybody ignores them and so on. And there's a...
very unrealistic.
That's right. Yeah. And one of the things that they always say, the computer says no sometimes, and that's the bureaucrat, right? The computer is the bureaucrat who you can't argue with. He's just almost a robot.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, we're going to have to learn some new ways of interacting with, saying yes and no to computers and having them try to say yes and no to us. But at the end of the day, I think we're in charge. And one of the things that I would that I learned from this panel and that I've been thinking for a long time is that the ultimate issue isn't what technology is going to do to us. It's what we want to do with the technology's tools. And I want to thank you all very much for helping with that discussion. Liz, Iyad, and Jason, that was a great discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Erik. Thanks very much.